Again, before I introduce Peter Corning, who's going to speak for 40 minutes without slides, give us plenty of time for discussion, I want to commemorate the Nobel Prize going to John Mukir. I looked up the records, and he gave us a talk in January, just over 2 years ago, 2023. And he's a very keen devotee of Darwinian and evolutionary ideas in social sciences, particularly economic history. So that's good news for Joel and for us, I think, as well. Anyway, to introduce Peter, I've known Peter for a long while, and Peter is very prolific, producing books on evolution in general terms, in biological terms, and a lot of stuff about the application of Darwinian and other evolutionary ideas to society. And we're looking forward to your talk, Peter. Welcome. Please start.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. Let me just preface by saying that I've had some health problems recently, so I'm going to rely on a reading copy of this talk this morning. I hope you'll forgive me. At least it will be coherent. The idea that evolution is a purposeful or teleological process has been rejected by evolutionary biologists ever since Darwin's day. Indeed, the distinction between a contingent historical trial and success process, in biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky's term, and a deterministic directional process, whether divinely sanctioned or as a result of some natural force or law, lies at the very heart of the great divide between the scientific and religious worldviews. The late Stephen Jay Gould, a leading paleontologist of the 20th century, was particularly eloquent about it. He firmly rejected the idea of evolutionary progress and proposed that evolution has been more like a drunkard's walk. However, there can be no denying that the extensive evidence of an overall trend in evolution over time is real, and there's been really ever-growing complexity over the course of several billion years. Along with a rise in the greater power to shape the evolutionary process in purposeful ways, as highlighted in the recent work that's been done in areas such as phenotypic plasticity, niche construction theory, gene culture coevolution theory, and genetic engineering. This, I think, is best exemplified in the rise of Homo sapiens. Thus, there remains a deep conundrum in evolutionary theory. How did biological purposiveness, what the biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky long ago called an internal teleology, evolve, and how did this contribute to the enormous biological complexity and diversity that we can observe today? Perhaps the earliest modern theorist to, quote, modern theorist, to propose the idea of an inherent evolutionary trend toward complexity was the 18th and early 19th century naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Although the basic idea can actually be traced back to Aristotle, if you care to do so. In his book, Zoological Philosophy, which was published in 1809, Lamarck spoke of an inherent energetic trend, a power of life, which foreshadowed Herbert Spencer's law of evolution and energy-centered law in the 1850s, as well as the aspirations of some modern-day physicists and complexity theorists. Darwin was deeply opposed to this formulation, although he did recognize Lamarck's role in championing the idea that was then unpopular, that evolution had been a gradual process over time. Lamarck is best known, even infamous, for his thesis that the course of evolution has been shaped by, quote, habits acquired by conditions, or the direct inheritance of traits developed during the lifetime of an individual. This idea didn't originate with Lamarck. It was kind of in the air at the time, and Darwin could only guess what the precise, that Lamarck could only guess at the precise mechanism of inheritance, because of course he lived long before the discovery of genes and the genetic code. The long necks of giraffes served Lamarck as an illustration. He proposed that this distinctive animal trait arose because ancestral giraffes had stretched their necks to reach progressively to reach the leaves and overhead acacia leaves, the trees, and that these changes in the neck were passed on to the offspring of these animals. Darwin was scornful of this idea in his earlier years. He said, quote, "Heaven forfend me from Lamarck's nonsense," in a letter to a friend in 1844. But in The Origin of Species, Darwin displayed his usual scientific caution by not ruling out the possibility that environmental influences and, as he put it, quote, "the use and disuse of parts could be a source of biological variation and adaptation in nature." Darwin even cited some possible evidence in his favor. Yet Darwin considered Lamarckian influences to be a minor subsidiary to natural selection. Excuse me. The rise of the science of genetics in the early 20th century put a conclusive end to Lamarck's theory of acquired characters. In a classic, if somewhat gruesome, experiment, the pioneer geneticist August Weismann cut off the tails of 20 successive generations of mice without, of course, producing a tailless strain. Other evidence against Lamarck's thesis could be found in the practices of farmers and pet breeders who routinely dock tails, notch ears, castrate males, spay females, and so on. None of these traits are heritable. And of course, there are a lot of human traits, including modern things like tattoos, that don't get inherited either. Unfortunately, in the process of rejecting the Lamarckian view of inheritance, the baby got thrown out with the bathwater. The role of behavior as an important causal factor in evolutionary change was also summarily rejected. Weismann's claim that random mutations were the underlying source of creativity in evolution became one of the cornerstones of the new science of genetics and ultimately of a gene-centered evolutionary theory. For a time, Weismann's mutation theory even eclipsed Darwinism, but in the 1930s, there was a new theoretical synthesis that recognized that if mutations in the process of recombination in sexual reproduction are responsible for producing biological novelties, they must subsequently be tested in the environment by natural selection. Although this mechanistic, gene-centered paradigm appealed to a young biological science that aspired to mimic the law-governed rigor of physics, than the queen of the sciences. It also provided an insufficient account of the dynamics of evolution because it left the organism out of the equation. The phenotype was treated as a passive object, a black box, whose fate was determined by the impersonal forces of genes and the environment. The biologist Patrick Bateson called it the billiard ball theory of evolution. However, living systems are more than billiard balls or robot vehicles, in biologist Richard Dawkins' term. They are, in fact, active participants in the evolutionary process. While Lamarck may have guessed wrong about the machinery of intelligence, he deserves credit for recognizing the importance of the organism and its behavior as a distinct causal agency in evolution. Lamarck appreciated that functional adaptation of the environment is a problem for any organism. However, he observed that the environment is not fixed, and if circumstances change, an animal won't survive. Changes in the environment over the course of time can thus be expected to give rise to new needs, which in turn stimulate the adoption of new animal habits. Furthermore, Lamarck asserted, changes in habits come first and structural changes may follow that. Lamarck wrote, quote, "It is not the organs of an animal's body that have given rise to its special habits and faculties, but it is on the contrary, its habits and mode of life and environment that have in the course of time controlled the shape of its body, the number and state of its organs, and lastly, the faculties which it possesses." Darwin also appreciated the role of behavior in evolutionary change, but his view of its relative importance was much more guarded. Darwin wrote, quote, "It is difficult to tell and immaterial for us whether habits generally change first and structure afterwards, or whether slight modifications of structure lead to changed habits. Probably both often change almost simultaneously." Many of Darwin's successors and followers were not so ecumenical. But at the turn of the 20th century, a movement developed concurrently among several British and American scientists who in effect Darwinized Lamarckism and gave behavior a more prominent role in evolution. Although their perspectives were generally lumped together under the psychologist James Mark Baldwin's term organic selection, from a modern perspective, Baldwin's organic selection theory was crudely formulated. It was worded ambiguously. It was not at first firmly Darwinian. It displayed a deficient understanding of natural selection. It was based on a rudimentary pain-pleasure model of behavior, and it did not lend itself to being bench tested, so to speak, in the way that genetically determined traits can be manipulated in laboratory strains of fruit flies or laboratory mice. It was also hypothetical. With the emergence of genetics and the organic selection idea, and Lamarckism went into total eclipse. However, its eclipse proved to be temporary. In the early 1950s, a modest effort to rehabilitate organic selection was undertaken by the paleontologist George Gillard Simpson, who renamed it the Baldwin effect. However, Simpson treated it as a subsidiary phenomenon in evolution. He did not even mention Lamarck. Meanwhile, an independent-minded British embryologist and geneticist, Conrad Hal Waddington, directly challenged the mainstream viewpoint when he produced an experimental evidence for a Darwinized version of Lamarckian inheritance that he called genetic assimilation. Waddington showed that certain developmentally influenced behavioral characters like sensitivity to various environmental stimuli could be enhanced through differential selection to the point where the traits could appear spontaneously, even in the absence of the stimuli. Waddington also became a vocal critic of the gene-centered view of evolution. As he pointed out, quote, "It is the animal's behavior which, to a considerable extent, determines the nature of the environment to which it will submit itself and the character of the selective forces with which it will consent to wrestle. This feedback or circularity in the relation between an animal and its environment is rather generally neglected in present-day evolutionary theorizing." A major mainstream reconsideration of this issue occurred in the late 1950s when the American Psychological Association and the then new Society for the Study of Evolution excuse me, jointly organized a set of conferences that resulted in the important edited volume called Behavior and Evolution. This often cited work contained a motherlode of tantalizing ideas. There was the suggestion that adaptive radiations were an important aspect of evolutionary change, and that they might be fundamentally behavioral in nature. There was the suggestion that behavior might often serve as an isolating mechanism in the formation of new species, that all organisms inclusive of their behavior are teleonomic or purposeful, and that finally the process of evolutionary change, new behaviors might appear first and genetic changes may follow. That was Ernst Mayr. None of this was associated with the discredited Lamarck, of course. Mayr, the biologist Mayr, elaborated on his views a couple of years later in a major article on the emergence of evolutionary novelties, in which he characterized behavioral changes as the pacemaker of evolution. In the late 1950s and 1960s, there were a number of publications that amounted to a crescendo of arguments for learning in behavior and evolution. There were such important books as W.H. Thorp's Learning and Instinct in Animals, C.H. Waddington's two books, The Strategy of the Genes and the Nature of Life, Alistair Hardy's The Living Stream, Lancelot Law White's Internal Factors in Evolution, Robert Hines' Animal Behavior, a Synthesis of Evolution, of Ethology and Comparative Psychology, and Arthur Koestler's The Ghost in the Machine. Many of the novel behaviors that were described in these classic works have become legendary. For example, the blue tits that learn to remove milk bottle caps, problem-solving behaviors in chimpanzees and in honeybees, and inventive Japanese macaques, and others. In the half century since the 1960s, the research literature on learning and innovation in organisms, from smart bacteria to human tutored apes and playful dolphins, has grown to cataract proportions. Indeed, there's now so much of it that some of the excellent earlier work is being forgotten. The examples are almost endless. Worms, fruit flies, honeybees, guppies, stickleback fish, ravens, various songbirds, hens, rats, gorillas, chimpanzees, elephants, dolphins, whales, and others. One cynic has pointed out that behavioral scientists have only confirmed what pet lovers and circus animal trainers have known for centuries. And in the index to their 2000 book on animal traditions, Eitan Avital and Eva Zablanka listed over 200 different species. So our respect for the cognitive abilities of various animals has also continued to grow. Innumerable studies have documented that many species are capable of sophisticated cost-benefit calculations, sometimes involving several variables, such as perceived risks, energetic costs, time expenditures, nutrient quality, resource alternatives, relative abundance, and more. Animals are constantly required to make decisions about habitats, foraging, food options, travel routes, nest sites, even mates. Many of these decisions are under tight genetic control, but many more are, at least in part, the product of experience, trial and error learning, observation, and even perspective. We suspect some insight learning. One classic example is ornithologist Bernd Heinrich's experiments, in which naive ravens quickly learned how to pull up fishing lines that were tied to their perch using their beaks and claws in order to capture food rewards that were attached to the ends. I should add that Heinrich's classic 1999 book, The Mind of the Raven, provides extensive evidence for the mental abilities of these remarkable birds. And biologists Simon Gilroy and Anthony Truevis have found that even plants make decisions. In the marine alga fucus, for example, at least 17 environmental conditions can be sensed, and the information that it collects is then either summed or integrated synergistically as appropriate. Especially important are the many forms of social learning through stimulus enhancement, contagion effects, emulation, and even teaching. Social learning has been documented in many species of animals, from rats to bats to lions, as well as some birds, fish, and of course, humans. Tool use is an especially significant and widespread category of adaptive behavior in the natural world, from insects to insectivores and omnivores, and it is utilized for a wide variety of purposes. Not surprisingly, the most potent cognitive skills have been found in social animals, especially the great apes. They displayed intentional behavior, planning, social coordination, understanding of cause and effect, anticipation, generalization, even deception. Primatologists Richard Byrne and Andrew Whiten, in their two important edited volumes, refer to it as Machiavellian intelligence. Social learning provides a powerful means which humankind is, of course, greatly enhanced for accumulating and diffusing and perpetuating novel adaptations without waiting for slower acting changes to occur. Finally, it's important to note the role of culture and cultural transmission in evolutionary change. The debate about culture in other species like chimpanzees may still be unresolved, but there can be no doubt that behavioral and cultural evolution played an important role in human evolution. For an extensive review of this thesis, you might refer to my 2018 book, Synergistic Selection: How Cooperation Has Shaped Evolution and the Rise of Humankind. The biologists Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan, in their 1995 book, What is Life?, characterized evolution as a sentient symphony. What is most significant about the behavior of living organisms, they claimed, is their ability to make choices. For the record, Waddington mounted a similar argument back in the 1950s, as did Lloyd Morgan in 1896. So it's an old argument that keeps being reborn. Margulis and Sagan, using a bit of poetic license, wrote, quote, "At even the most primordial level, living seems to entail sensation, choosing, and mind. Nevertheless, there is still some reluctance among evolutionary biologists to recognize, and the public to recognize, the fundamental purposiveness and partial autonomy of living systems, and to incorporate this into the core of evolutionary theory. Physics, which was long regarded as a model science, has traditionally pursued the search for impersonal mechanistic laws that are applicable anywhere and anywhen. Teleology has no place in this enterprise, and in earlier generations, biology slavishly followed suit. But in the 1960s and 1970s, numerous voices were raised against this deficient view of how living systems work. The case was argued most eloquently, perhaps by biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky. And here's a quote: "Purposefulness or teleology does not exist in non-living systems. It is universal in the living world. It would make no sense to talk of purposefulness or adaptation of stars, mountains, or the laws of physics. The adaptedness of living beings is too obvious to be overlooked. Living beings have an internal or natural teleology. Organisms from the smallest bacterium to man arise from similar organisms by ordered growth and development. Their internal teleology has accumulated in the history of their lineage. On the assumption that all existing life is derived from one primordial ancestor, the internal teleology of an organism is the outcome of approximately 3.5 billion years of organic evolution. Internal teleology is not a static property of life. Its advances and recessions can be observed, sometimes induced experimentally, and analyzed scientifically like other biological phenomena. The term that is most often used by biologists these days to characterize the internal teleology of living organisms is teleonomy. It was originally coined by biologist Colin Pittendrich in connection with the 1958 Conference on Behavior and Evolution. The term connotes the fact that purposefulness found in nature is a product of evolution and of natural selection, and is not of some external grand design. Teleonomy in living systems is today accepted without question, and yet few theorists take the next step and draw out the implications for evolutionary theory. Teleonomy puts organisms into a unique category. An organism cannot be reduced to the laws of physics or be derived from those laws, because its properties, inclusive of its structure, its behavior, and its historical trajectory, cannot be predicted from those laws. For instance, the laws of physics are silent about the phenomenon of feedback, which is fundamental in the informational processes of living systems. In his celebrated book, Chance and Necessity, in 1971, the Nobel Prize-winning geneticist Jacques Monod characterized evolution as a process that is governed by two great influences, chance and necessity. In Monod's formulation, the teleonomy of living systems is an epiphenomenon of random mutations and, quote, the lock-in, as he called it, of natural selection. Although Monod did acknowledge the role of behavior in evolution, he treated it as a bit player in the process. Monod did not give it a starring role except in human evolution. In the final peroration of his book, Monod concluded, quote, "Man knows at last that he is alone in the universe's unfeeling immensity, out of which he emerged only by chance." In the spirit of Lamarck and a long line of dissenters from this constricted vision of evolution, I strongly disagree. The purposiveness of living organisms has been a major agency in evolution. Whether or not there is purposiveness or directionality in the process as a whole is a question best left to the theologians and complexity theorists. From an evolutionary perspective, the natural world displays, quote, the piling up of little purposes, as Lynn Margulis and Dorian Saven called it in 1995. Teleonomy is found at every level in living systems. As Monod himself pointed out, it is embedded in the genome of every living system. It's involved in morphogenesis and development. It is evident in the phenotype, both in its morphology and its behavior, and it imposes many functional imperatives and constraints on how an organism goes about earning its living. As noted earlier, there's much greater appreciation today for the role of development and life history influences in shaping the phenotypes of various species, from the hormonal state of the mother to ambient weather conditions, the animal's environments, and so on. Terms like phenotypic plasticity, norms of reaction ranges are commonplace. And there are frequent references to the complex interplay of various factors via epigenetic cascades and ontogenetic networks and the like. Differential access to information is also a major source of epigenetic variation. And niche construction theory highlights the fact that animals frequently modify their environments in purposeful ways, from beaver dams to chimpanzee sleeping nests, mole rat burrows, and the ornate courtship bowers that distinguish the bowerbirds. Much of the research relating to the teleonomic model of behavior these days goes under the heading of behavioral ecology and cognitive ethology. And there's been a lively debate about the nature of animal intelligence and whether or not animals have minds. These issues aside, the common thread is the assumption that animals are intentional systems, in philosopher Daniel Dennett's term. It is taken as a given that there is at least a degree of autonomy, some degrees of freedom in the shaping of animal choices, or the word agency is very common too. This issue was clarified by the science of cybernetics, which traces its origins to Norbert Wiener's foundational 1948 book, Cybernetics, or Control in the Communication in the Animal and the Machine. How are we doing on time here, by the way?
Are you okay, Peter?
Okay.
10 more minutes.
Okay. Wiener established conclusively that goal-directed dynamic systems can no longer be considered unscientific or be dismissed as a black box. Cybernetics provides a general model for understanding biological purposiveness and teleonomy. The pioneering systems theorist William Powers, in his important book Behavior, the Control of Perception, in 1973, showed that the behavior of a cybernetic system can be described mathematically in terms of its tendency to oppose an environmental disturbance of some internally controlled quantity. That is to say, the system will operate in such a way that some function of its output quantities will be nearly equal and opposite to some function of a disturbance in some of those environmental qualities that affect the controlled quantity, with the result that the controlled quantity will remain nearly at its 0 point. The classic example is a household thermostat. It operates to maintain a preset temperature. It's important to note that cybernetic control processes are not limited to one level of biological organization. Over the past decades, we have come to appreciate the fact that they exist at many levels of living systems. They can be observed in, among other things, morphogenesis, cellular activity, neuronal network operation, as well as in the orchestration of animal behavior. Some of the many examples include bacterial colonies, cnidaria, honeybees, army ants, slime molds, and of course humans. Powers and his colleagues have devoted many years to developing what he calls perceptual control theory, which melds cybernetics and human psychology. With the increasing development of cybernetic control processes in biological evolution over the course of time, a subtle but important threshold was crossed. Self-organization in evolution was augmented by the emergence of self-determination, the behavioral ability to set and pursue internally defined behavioral goals. This increasingly has determined the outcome in terms of survival and reproduction. It's clear that the traditional ways of characterizing evolution, such as Jacques Monod's chance and necessity, psychologist Donald Campbell's blind variation and selective retention, Ernst Mayer's two-step tandem process, and philosopher Daniel Dennett's blind algorithmic process, whatever that may mean, they're inadequate and require modification. Evolution, like a wagon pulled by a team of horses, has harnessed four distinct classes of influences: chance, necessity, teleonomy, and selection. Actually, there are five classes if you include synergy or cooperative effects. See my books from 1983 to 2018. Chance, meaning unpredictable historical contingencies, is a factor at every level of life, from mutations to tsunamis. Necessity, too, is found at all levels, from the underlying laws of physics and chemistry to the frozen accidents of the genetic code, as well as the emergent properties of the physical and biotic environment. And the same is true of teleonomy and selection. All four classes of influences exist at every level in living systems. Another way of framing the idea is that evolution very often involves four distinct categories of variation: molecular genetic, phenotypic, inclusive of developmental influences and behavioral variations, ecological, environmental variation, and differential survival as an outcome of the specific organism-environment relationships in a given context. Furthermore, the causal arrows between these domains can go in both directions. In my 1983 book, The Synergism Hypothesis, I characterized the causal role of behavioral influences in evolution as teleonomic selection in order to highlight their purposive nature. Teleonomic selection can be defined as goal-related behavioral choices that may have consequences for differential survival and reproduction, and of course, of evolution over time. It refers to internally determined cybernetic behavioral innovations or changes that alter the relationship between an organism and its environment. The proposition here is that teleonomic selection and classical natural selection often work hand in hand to affect evolutionary change. One example of teleonomic selection is the often indirect causal influence of behavioral choices in evolution. In the rainforest of the Olympic National Park in the state of Washington, there is intense competition among towering evergreen trees, the western hemlock, Sitka spruce, Douglas fir, and western cedar, all inside a crowded forest canopy. The hemlocks produce by far the most seeds and are the best adapted to growing in the low sunlight conditions of the park as a consequence of both competition and weather. However, it's the Sitka spruce that dominates, and the reason is that the abundant Roosevelt elk in the park feed heavily on young hemlock trees and do not feed on Sitka spruce. In other words, the food preferences of the elk is the proximate cause of differential survival between the hemlock and the spruce trees. It also should be noted that the basic idea underlying teleonomic selection is not really new. At the turn of the century, there was organic selection. In the 1920s, there was holistic selection by Jan Smuts. In the 1960s, there was internal selection by Lancelot White and Arthur Koestler. And more recently, there's been psychological selection, Mundinger, and rational pre-selection by Bohm. Baldwinian selection, Terence Deacon. Neo-Lamarckian evolution, Jablonka and Lamb, and behavioral selection, various writers. Another variant, social selection, has been deployed recently with regard to social interactions, especially in human evolution. Though there are some differences between these concepts, the core idea is essentially the same. Teleonomic selection is a purposeful cybernetic process, an active choosing that always occurs in the minds of living organisms. It is living beings that do the selecting, and it is related to the meeting of basic survival and reproductive needs in a given organism and context. The term teleonomic selection also honors the fact that minds have emergent properties that allow for purposeful problem solving, innovation, and decision making. As the biologist Patrick Bateson put it, quote, "Whole organisms survive and reproduce differentially, and the winners drag their genotypes with them. This is the engine of Darwinian evolution, and the reason why it is so important to understand how whole organisms behave and develop. Bateson characterized the role of behavior as an adaptability driver in evolution. Many years ago, biologist Ernst Mayr drew a useful distinction between proximate causes and ultimate causes in evolution, concepts that are somewhat analogous to Aristotle's distinction between efficient causes and final causes. Proximate causes refer to the machinery of development and the physiology, biochemistry, and behavior of a mature phenotype. Ultimate causes refer to the role of natural selection or differential survival and reproduction. In practice, proximate and ultimate forms of causation are interpenetrated with one another. Proximate causes associated with what I call teleonomic selection may also be responsible for shaping ultimate causes. Behavioral choices may be the efficient cause of natural selection. Teleonomic selection is implicated in habitat choices, adaptive radiations, dietary choices, predator-prey interaction, even what Lynn Margulis, after Merezhkovsky, called symbiogenesis. As the history of Homo sapiens clearly illustrates, teleonomy and self-determination have become increasingly influential in the overall course of the evolutionary process. Cybernetics, information science, and semiotics, the science of signs and meanings, have illuminated and highlighted the emergent and ever-expanding role of intelligence in evolution. Indeed, it is important to remember that automobiles, airplanes, moon rockets, the internet, iPhones, iPads, even AI are also products of the evolutionary process of evolved intelligence. However, this does not lend support to the other aspect of Lamarck's thinking, his vision of an overarching direction or goal in evolution. Dobzhansky appropriately characterized evolution as a grand experiment in adaptiveness, an open-ended challenge, a grand adventure with an ultimate outcome that cannot be foretold. Like other living organisms, humankind tends to focus on solving the problems of living in a given economic and cultural environment. Our cultural and evolutionary technology has entailed, in essence, an economic process involving means and ends and costs and benefits in relation to the ongoing challenges of survival and reproduction. It has not been our purpose, as a general rule, to follow some overarching evolutionary path or societal goal, and any pretensions in this regard have generally fallen short. Previous generations of evolutionists were doomed to be disappointed in their visions of evolutionary progress. Natural selection slavishly adheres to the law of unintended effects. We would be better advised to focus on the currently popular buzzword, sustainability. This will be quite enough of a challenge for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Peter. Very stimulating. Would anybody like to ask Peter a question? Marion. Marion, please come in.
Would you say that teleonomic selection implies that when new statistical when new variations occur, they're statistically biased in the direction that would be required for them to be adaptive?
No. On the contrary, it's
good, because sometimes the term evolution on purpose would mean that to people.
Well, that's why I use quotes around it and immediately follow that by an explanation of what that term means.
Yeah.
The answer is no. It really depends on which humans are doing the deciding.
That's good. Because decades and decades ago, I used the term purposiveness in the title of my PhD thesis on this subject. And David Hull kept saying, yes, but you got to be careful, you got to be careful. And my argument was simply that you can have, genomes are complicated. There's so many different stages of things, genes, and controlling the expression of other genes, controlling the expression of other genes. There are all kinds of hierarchies and networks here. And so if you have an influence that is environmental, on development, on behavior, on whatever, that doesn't mean that it will end up being adaptive. But you can get these situations where under condition C1, you do A1, on condition C2, you do A2. You can evolve all kinds of networks of these kinds of complicated pathways, developmentally, behaviorally. And the other thing is you emphasize social learning, but of course, social learning is not always biologically adaptive either, as we know well. It depends upon how the culture is transmitted. If it's transmitted vertically from parents to offspring or close related kin, it usually is. But what about if it's translated horizontally? There's all kinds of exploitation going on. I love the example of sects and cults, where they convince you the members of the cult are your real family and you have to do everything to spread the membership in the cult and never mind your own family and so on. So yeah. It depends upon how they're transmitted. If they're transmitted vertically, sure. If they're transmitted horizontally, oh no. And if they're transmitted obliquely, it's even more complicated. So culture isn't always biologically adaptive, that's for sure.
Oh, no, I quite agree with that. And I agree with what you're saying, too.
You covered a lot of interesting ground. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Yeah. we need only look at the history of World War II to evaluate how cultural influences can produce a very
Disaster,
self-destructive outcome.
right? For sure. Thank you.
And we live in a time when I'm also holding my breath. I'll say no more.
Yeah. Things are quiet in the Middle East for now, but the poor Ukrainians are still suffering.
Oh, yeah.
Peter Mammon.
Yes.
Peter. Your microphone's off.
Yes.
Okay, now can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on Marianne's points. So I mainly study the development of firms and industries and economies. And when I reflect on your talk, I very much would agree that, human beings, people who run firms, typically have purposes. They want to achieve something, okay? So to give you one analogy, most of the people who enter the pop charts have the goal of being the number one, having the number one song, right? But in that case, the purpose or the intent of having a number one song does very little at explaining who at the end has the number one song. So I'm trying to parse out by simply making the point there is purposefulness that is a long distance from actually explaining outcomes in the world. Right? And so I'm trying to get you to along from Marianne's point of view, I'm trying to get you to say a bit more, what by simply asserting that, and let's stay with human beings, because I know the human species best, right? What are you claiming that you can now explain by asserting purposefulness in the world that you cannot explain without it? Or put it another way is, do you believe that purposefulness is the same as intent, that you explain outcomes based on purpose or intent?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Purposefulness is not a prediction of an outcome. It is only a prediction at best of the behavior of living organisms. They will act in purposeful ways. They will have purposes to be the number one on the pop chart, and also earn a lot of money. That might have something to do with it. But that is not the same as saying that is the sole determinant of the outcome of any given situation. There are a lot of other factors, including, say a tsunami or a hurricane, that may have something to do with determining the outcome in a social and environmental context. We are dealing with other forces and factors in the natural world, as well as our own purposes, and our own purposes may be misguided. It may lead to very deleterious consequences. We may think it's a good idea not to be vaccinated, and that might turn out to be a very bad idea. But that's getting us into another political realm here. So I'm just suggesting that the purposefulness of living organisms is a factor it's part of that wagon train that determines the outcome in terms of the history of life on Earth.
Okay, can I have one more follow-up? So there's a very fascinating study, and if you've never seen this, I encourage you to look at it, where two sociologists asked the question, to what extent is having the top song determined by luck, or to what extent it's determined by you simply craft a better song? And to give you the very simple summary of this is, yes, if you have 100 songs, 30 of the 100 songs, you can say they're so bad they never have a chance of being number one. Okay, so 30% you can say, 30 you can filter out and say they are not in a set. But for the next 70, you have no way of knowing who is going to be the number one song. So to put it another way is, so what I'm pushing back on is selection at the end. The forces of selection is what is determining the outcome. Yes, there's a little bit of a role that, of purposefulness by having more skill in doing something, but the selection is still the overwhelming force. And so this is where I'm going with my question is purposefully, and this is where I think, Marion, you were going as well, right? Is purposefulness giving some in a major direction on what the outcome is going to be? Or is it simply stating that, these organisms, they go after some goals, and that will mean is, as you just said, is they certain behaviors are going to be more or less likely, but without making judgments on whether these behaviors at the end will be selected for or against?
I'm really not sure exactly what you're driving toward here.
Okay.
But the answer is that living organisms make selections, and those sometimes influence the course of evolution.
Okay.
The example that I chose of the evergreen trees in Washington State's forests was an example of how the differential survival of different organisms can be partially determined by the behavior of other organisms, their preferences, their choices, their purposes.
Yeah.
And so I'm talking about an influence in evolution, which to somebody who believes that genes explain evolution, explain the evolutionary process, have totally missed the point.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. But Jan-Willem.
Yeah, I think I'm probably following up a little bit on the gist of the previous questions. I really enjoyed your talk. So first of all, thank you for that. I also completely buy into the idea that some of the views of evolution have sort of underplayed behavior, and that we need to bring that back in, and maybe that's central to the whole story, what organisms or any other agent you want to study actually does. I can also see that sort of from a systems thinking perspective, you need to think about organisms having some objective function. Yeah, so some goal, something they're trying to achieve.
Survival and reproduction, biological survival. I mean, that's the common goal of all living organisms.
So against that background, what I'm wondering is, and I was understanding Peter and maybe to some extent Marion's question along those lines. I still have the question: do we need an additional concept in the following sense? If I were to reduce, and some people may not agree with specifically that reduction, but the evolutionary process to variation, selection, retention, that's sort of the Campbell Campbell idea, a three-step. Wouldn't the purposiveness of a particular organism be explained by variation, selection, retention? In other words, it has to come from somewhere, right? It has to be explained. And my guess would be that we can explain the things we observe, including the behavior and the purposiveness of the behavior, in terms of variation, selection, retention. So what I got towards the end of your talk from what you were saying is that we need an additional concept somehow. And I'm not sure that follows. I mean, even if we want to give behavior the central position in the story that it deserves, we still need to explain the behavior. And how else would we explain it other than variation, selection, retention? And how else would we explain the purposiveness of the behavior, the particular purpose that an animal may be after?
Well, let me ask you this: what is variation? Is it random, or can there be avenues and roads that variation follows?
Yeah, I would buy into your idea that these things are multi-layered. So how my particular brain works as opposed to yours or anybody else's here, I mean, I've been shaped developmentally in terms of my life history to sort of have certain things that I may be more salient to me, or certain objectives that I find more important. But still, whatever at this moment my purposiveness is, and the form it takes for me personally, I think can still be explained by previous processes of variation, selection, retention. And part of that may be sort of genetic, part of that is life history, but all of those things in sort of layers of variation, selection, retention are, to me, the product of an evolutionary process.
Well, I would turn that on its head or whatever, and say that variation, that purposiveness can explain variation.
Yeah, so there may be a feedback loop in the sense that when I was born, presumably everything was instinctual, and then there's layers of learning on top of that. Much of that learning is social, as you say. I buy into all of that, and then at some point, as a I would say as a product of variation, selection, retention, I may have these sort of these channels or these goals that sort of direct the variation of my future learning. I think there we would agree. But how my learning today is directed, I think, would still be the outcome of a previous historically variation, selection, retention process. So in that sense, I'm sort of wondering if we, even if we, and I do accept most of what you're saying, I'm not sure if we need something fundamentally different in how we understand the evolutionary process. That sort of, my question is, what does it add?
Well, I have a if you will, a dark view of the future, in which I think humans may screw it all up and we may go extinct. That's actually a possibility, because there are some major climate changes occurring now that are going to greatly affect our ability to survive and reproduce. Those are human actions or inactions, and those purposeful or purposeless, if you like, actions are of enormous evolutionary consequence. For example, we forget that an important stage in evolution was the the emergence of oxygen breathing organisms, that only occurred after the point in which the atmosphere changed dramatically from one that was basically anaerobic to an aerobic atmosphere. Sorry, something popped up on me here. So it was the change in the atmosphere, a major climate change, that permitted the evolution of all of the aerobic organisms on Earth. And that kind of a change of fundamental importance to the survival of living organisms is in the offing now. We face that perhaps not in our lifetime, but relatively shortly thereafter, because we are really messing with the environment in so many ways. And those actions are purposeful actions. The purposes are clearly not related to survival and reproduction. They're related to some other thing that humans have, some other goal, producing more tires, digging more coal. But without those human purposes, or if those human purposes changed, it might change the outcome. But it changes the outcome because environmental changes are a consequence of the changes in our behavior.
Can I come in there? I'm got similar nuanced issues that Jan Willem and Marion and Peter's have raised. Okay, purpose is very important. Let's agree on. I don't. Anyone is saying that's not the case, at least so far, and I'm with those that are saying it's very important. Okay, that's the first point. The second point is that we cannot understand purpose simply by a gene-based view of organisms. Okay, you made that point very clear. Okay, so where does purpose come from? Okay, and there's some kind of explanation, which I think, if I understand you correctly, you're on board with, is it comes from a complex emergent set of relationships in an environment which causes people to choose A over B or to do X over Y. Okay. Now that is fine and it's very important. I mean, you cited Conrad Waddington, and I think he's an important theoretical biologist in this context. And one of his major points, if I remember correctly, was the distinction between genotype and phenotype. So what's evolving is not simply the genotype expressed large. What's evolving is things which have developed partly from their genotypes and in circumstances have changed and made choices and done things so they have become a phenotype. So we are humans and we're either capable or incapable of making the right decisions concerning the climate. Okay. And your pessimism, I'm not going to, unfortunately, I can't think of a good reason to say you're completely wrong. Well, no, we're going to make a decision. But whatever that happens, there is something purposeful. But the key point is that purpose itself has a causal explanation. And Darwin, in his philosophical writings, was very clear about this. He says, I don't know the cause of this or that. I don't know the cause of variation. I don't know anything about genes. He didn't say that, but he didn't know anything about genes. He speculated, but he said, ultimately, we need a causal explanation. Right? So we don't have a philosophical dualism where there is mind and matter being separate, because mind is an emergent property of matter, and all the things that cause things in complicated ways, with all the possible choices and bifurcations all the way through, lead to the phenomenon. Okay. Now, if you're on board with that, I'm quite happy with what you said. I mean, and I think that's consistent with Darwin. It's consistent with all sorts of people, all sorts of philosophers in this. that purpose is in some sense important, but purpose is itself caused and is not independent. Are you
yeah.
happy with what I just said? Or unhappy? Don't mind.
Yeah, no, I'm entirely agree with that. The word purpose is a slippery one.
Yeah.
Because it can mean different things, and those different meanings can lead to different consequences in terms of its significance as a causal agency in living systems or between living systems in the environment. So I'm not entirely comfortable with the concept. It's not a concept that I am pushing. It's only a useful way of drawing attention to a causal factor in evolution, which is becoming increasingly important and increasingly determinant of the evolutionary species, evolutionary future, not only of our species, but of all living species. That's what really haunts me.
So thanks, Peter. I mean, I think we are on the same hymn sheet, if I can use that religious
Can I just
metaphor.
add one thing?
Yeah.
I would just add that the most important empirical evidence for purposefulness, in the sense in which I understand that you mean it, is plasticity. In other words, this kind of condition happens, and we're starting to do this, and then the conditions change. Oh, if we want to bring out that result, we have to switch to doing this. This plasticity of switching around under different conditions in order to bring about the same result. The next important point, however, is that that kind of plasticity can evolve genetically. You can have plasticity in genes where genes control the expression of other genes, which control the expression, whole hierarchies and networks of them, so that in development or in physiology or in behavior, you can get this kind of plasticity because it's a result of the past history of selection under these different circumstances. But if it's a new environmental event inducing some kind of change, developmental, physiological, or behavioral, that is not because we have a past adaptation to this plasticity, then the results can be adaptive or maladaptive. You know, some environmental thing might hit me and make me act in this way, and that may be good or bad for me. Who knows? You know, but novel.
Yeah, thank you. Just bring in Peter Merman, then ask Peter Corning to finish up.
Sorry?
I'm now unmuted. Sorry, okay. Now I think you can hear me, right? So I want to respond to Jan. I think Jan, the way I understand Peter is he would say is variation is not random. I think that is his point, right? And so for me, the novel thing has been saying is I have long believed this about humans, right? But I think Peter makes the general point. This is true for the simplest living organisms, right? I mean, that is Peter's contribution is this idea that there's blind or random variation. This is even not true for the simplest organism. At least that to me is the novel message that I'm hearing.
Yeah, they're doing a lot of work on intelligence in bacterial organisms now.
Yeah.
Especially bacterial colonies where you have a social life.
Yeah. I mean, by the way, Darwin never said that in Darwin's version of Darwinism, there's no random variation. It's only in the 1930s, 1940s synthesis that you get this randomizing idea of mutation.
Yeah.
I mean, briefly prominent.
Yeah.
And you said that in your talk, Peter, about the descent from that in the 40s and 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Darwin was not a Darwinist, as so many of us think of him as being.
Yeah. Yeah, Peter, would you like to finish off with a final statement? It's very, very good to.
Oh, gosh,
Yeah.
I sort of thought I finished off with, I'm not sure if I have anything more to say, except that I think we are entering into a very different era in biological evolution writ large, as we humans become increasingly capable of affecting change and determining outcomes, and yet we don't know enough to be sure that we're going in the right direction.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that moon rockets and skyscrapers and all that are the right way for us to go as a species. That's what we've been doing for the last couple of thousand years. But we have some very serious problems that we have to, which should force us to rethink where we have been and where we're going, because that may well determine whether we get there or not.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Peter, for a fantastic talk. It's very stimulating. We could go on as usual, but especially with these very central and portentous issues you raised. We know your health has not been that good. We had to postpone your talk because you were going through some treatment a few months ago. I hope very much that you recover fully from. I don't know the details, but I went through cancer as well, and I seem to be okay. So I hope you do too, and all the best wishes, and thank you for all your contributions that you've made since well, you've listed some of the books you've done since the 80s. So it's great, very stimulating, very pertinent. Thank you very much indeed, Peter, and wish you all the best. And thank you everyone for listening and for your questions.
Thank you.